and welcome to another Video Crow Jam. This is the podcast where two sisters and an occasional guest have 1 hour to develop and pitch a board game idea. I am Georgia.
No, you're not.
I'm not Georgia. I was thinking about introducing my sister Georgia. I'm Miriam.
Off to a terrible
and I'm joined,
start.
as always, by she's Georgia, my sister Georgia.
It's true. The rumours of me being Georgia are confirmed.
And they've the theory that I'm Georgia. And we are joined this month by my friend Ollie. Ollie, would you like to say hi to the listener and tell them a bit about yourself and maybe like what kind of gaming habits you enjoy?
Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. Yeah, so I'm Ollie. I am big into board games. So I grew up playing tons of board games with my dad and younger brother. Fairly sort of simple-ish games like Carcassonne was a kind of favorite, or Ticket to Ride. And then kind of as we were growing up, we got into slightly heavier games. So a family favorite at the moment is Agricola, sort of medieval farming game. Dominant Species is another favorite. So sort of historically, my favorite games have been sort of quite big, heavy games. And my partner Rowan and I at one point developed a game. We made a game called Theurgy, which we launched on Kickstarter. And that was a really exciting and ultimately successful project, although it was extremely stressful at times. So yeah, so gaming has been a really big part of my life.
And we asked you to bring, as we always do, a one-word prompt for us to kind of like jump off of with our brainstorming and our jam. And what was the prompt that you brought?
So the word I came up with was
which like straight away, I have to say, when I knew that we were getting you on as a guest, I was like, oh, this will be nice. Like, it's been a while since we made a game that could like really be called, like crunchy or heavy. And then this word, definitely most of the things I thought of with it were more on the lighter end of games that I've played, I guess. Like it really mostly kind of prompted like reflex games or like cooperative games based on like limited communication but kind of a shared understanding, things like that. What were your kind of things that you were initially thinking about when you decided on this word?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So I don't want to disappoint you. If you want to design a kind of heavier, crunchier game, then I would be totally into that. But
it's not necessarily what you'd call me and George's wheelhouse, but we've strayed into that area on occasion.
We've attempted to crunch. I would say we make chewy games.
Yes, I mean, traditionally I've really loved these heavier games, but more recently I have got into kind of lighter games. Rowan very recently purchased a game called Fugitive, which is super light, but I absolutely loved on my first time playing it. We've sort of got quite into games like Seven Wonders Duel or Targi, sort of really good two-player games that I'd say are on sort of the lighter side. So I'm definitely happy to go down that road. In terms of what I was thinking of when you asked me to come up with a prompt, so I mean, I love games with a sort of nature theme or a sort of animal theme. I have always loved the idea of being a wolf.
You and me both, buddy.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I don't think that's a particularly original. So I guess partly I was thinking, oh, you sort of animal instincts. But at the time as well, I was so another game that I really like is chess. And this weekend I was at a chess tournament. And in chess, obviously there's a lot of calculation, there's some memorization and sort of planning and preparation as well. But also instinct plays a sort of surprisingly large role. The more you play, the more you get sort of instincts about the position you're in and sort of a sense of danger or a sense when you should sort of press an attack. And it's sort of yeah, quite hard to describe to someone who hasn't played lots of chess why you're attacking at this particular moment, or why you're sort of playing a certain kind of move to maybe shore up your position, but you kind of develop instincts. So I like this idea that instincts are kind of a little bit outside of your control. They're not kind of calculated, but they are something that you can kind of develop and improve as well.
And to I guess round out the spider diagram, Georgia, did you have any like particular thoughts going into this?
I had one idea that came off this, which I'm going to summarize as a game where you don't have to think too hard.
Yes, you know that I like those. It's also a request I regularly get as like in my job as like a game guide. Can we have one where we don't have to think too hard? Sometimes from people who just aren't big gamers, sometimes from people who are big gamers, but they're like, oh, you know, we're a bit tired, we're a bit hungover.
Yeah.
It's interesting to me to learn that it is more or less Ollie's job to think too hard. Or, you know, hard enough.
Yes. Yeah. I try and keep the thinking to a minimum, you know.
Well,
it's
a real busman's holiday, isn't it? Like if you get paid to think, you want to avoid doing it at other times. Although evidently not if you're
I wouldn't say that speaks to my experience of what kinds of thing. But yeah.
But there were loads of things that came out of this sort of initial ideas gathering that sort of prompted something for me that I liked. And one of them was this sort of dichotomy that we seem to have imagined between a game that is like, this is sort of inside baseball this term, but crunchy, you know, a game that has a lot going on, a game that requires a lot of engagement, that maybe has a lot of moving parts, versus a game that is light, a game where you can pick it up quickly, maybe is sort of easy to learn, hard to master, things like that. But it feels like, is it possible for what goes beyond that dichotomy? You know, can something be light and crunchy, except for in the biscuit world?
Cereal.
I consider that to be the biscuit world. I'm you know, okay. I just think taxonomies are really a waste of everyone's time.
Sure.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's quite tricky to come up with examples that are clearly sort of, light, crunchy games. I suppose, most people don't necessarily think of chess as a light game, but ultimately there aren't so many rules in chess, and
it's very rules light.
Yeah, it's very rules light, right? And another sort of chess-like game that I quite like is Onitama. Have either of you played Onitama?
I have not.
You haven't, but really you have.
Yeah, it's sort of it's in the world of games that are kind of like drafts or chess or that kind of thing, like a movement strategy game where you have a board and pieces moving. And I believe Onitama has like some interesting player objectives that are a little bit different, but the movement is kind of like this constant like exchange of moves. So there's like a pool of specific moves that are in any one game, and they constantly like exchange between the players. So when you use a move, it's almost like you're giving it to the other person to use in a later turn.
Yeah, exactly. And what's really nice is that, so I can't remember the exact size of the grid. It might be sort of 4x4, 5x5.
It's 5.
Yeah, 5x5. So you've got like this nice, relatively small grid, and the cards which show you how your pieces can move sort of highlight squares on the grid. So it's really easy to see where your piece can move to. So I don't know, I think of Onitama as a sort of maybe a light, crunchy game. That's my kind of best attempt at coming up with an example.
Yeah, there's another game which is just in a very similar vein, one called Kern, that is like, again, I think it's a 5x5 grid, and it's very much the same kind of idea, but where like there are sort of 3 different types of thing you can do on your turn, and each time you use one, you like flip over an action tile and it works slightly differently. So it would be like move orthogonally or move diagonally, or like jump over one of your own pieces, jump over one of your opponent's pieces. And each time you use it, it like swaps to its kind of inverse. so that, yeah, as well as like thinking about what you're doing, you're also thinking about like what the opportunity will be that you might give to your opponent.
Yeah. Although it doesn't sound like this will meet the criteria of a game where I don't have to think too hard.
No, there's definitely some thinking.
And I mean, you know, the idea of a game where you don't have to think too hard is definitely not me like coming down like a ton of bricks. It was just the only thought that I had. I'm quite open to an instinct game that involves some thinking. While you guys were thinking out loud, I sort of noted down some of the things that you said and some of the things that prompted for me in terms of what makes a game chess-like. So, you know, movement strategy, abstract or semi-abstract, maybe light on rules, maybe not too many pieces. Have you guys played Hive?
Yeah.
I think Hive's a really good, it's 2-player as well, which I think nearly all the examples we've talked about are. But yeah, that's got like pieces with movement rules. It's very minimal. I think that's a really nice piece of game design. I also drew a piece that was like a wolf chess piece.
Yeah,
you did draw
impressed.
that. I was so moving away from that a little bit, and I have the hour timer up at, like, when we're ready to sort of like,
I think, you know, I'm happy for you to hit the timer and for us to get stuck in.
Okay, here we go. The timer's begun. Another thing that I maybe thought about that was perhaps appealed to me is like, could there be a cooperative game? And I'm sort of imagining one where we play like a pack of wolves, I guess. But which is sort of like crunchy in the sense of there being, you know, like more than one stage, multiple components, maybe things like that. But could it be designed in such a way where we have to lean on instinct? Maybe there's like a limited communication element, or like we have to work together, but maybe
So I was going to say, like, one of the games that I thought about when I was thinking about games that use instinct is The Mind, where, you know, you sort of have to vibe it out, basically. You're supposed to try and read your fellow players.
Yeah, that was definitely a touchstone for me as well with instinct games. I don't know what this game would look like. I suppose, like, I was imagining almost kind of like a, you know, like an adorable sort of like fantasy novel style quest that some wolves have to go on, but they're really just wolves.
I mean, I love the sound of a co-op game where you're playing as a pack of wolves. That's dream. Yeah.
I really, really like that idea as well. Although I will say that my mind went to a far more sort of realism based place where maybe you are controlling pieces that have movement rules. Maybe the other players don't know your movement rules at first and have to intuit them by playing with you, but you're trying to do something like take down an elk.
Yeah. I basically, there's some kind of like pack objective, you know, something that like takes place over multiple turns, and but yes, what would that look like? I don't know.
Okay, so I can do some describing, but it will interrupt my ability to. I'm going to be drawing and talking at the same time, which will slow down my talking a little bit. But here's the idea that formed for me. So it would be a game that took place on a grid, and there would be a piece or pieces on the grid that maybe represented like types of terrain and an objective animal that your group has to successfully surround in order to win. So maybe in a 2-player game, you'd each control 2. In a 3-player game, you know, the difficulty might be different and you each control 3, but you have to surround it on all sides rather than just on the cardinal directions. But then within that, the players would each have secret movement rules. So it would be things like ways they can move or conditions under which they can move. So like you can only move a piece when it's adjacent to another piece, or you can, if you're next to another wolf, you can only move diagonally, or if you're next to a tree, you can only move orthogonally, things like that. Private to the player. they're not allowed to speak to one another, but perhaps there's like a simple communication system that allows them to maybe like, I'm not sure what it would be, but possibly with like token passing or something like that to say, you know, well, like I think this person has this role. Maybe the roles are sort of semi-known, but you just don't know who has which, something like that. So you cooperatively win by surrounding the target. Maybe you could do difficulty level things by having different numbers of targets or different positions. You could kind of have even maybe campaign play where you get a booklet that has positions set up. But that would be the idea. I feel like I talked for a long time and described almost a complete thing.
I mean, I think that sounds absolutely fantastic. As you were talking, something else that kind of just came to mind, just sort of a random idea, is it could be that, yeah, the terrain poses various kind of obstacles, and maybe certain obstacles can only be sort of overcome if there are a certain number of wolves in the right kind of configuration around that obstacle.
Yes, I love this.
Yeah, something along those lines.
I certainly like, so when I had the first iteration of this idea, I really was kind of imagining something where I don't suppose, not necessarily a game where a rule has been made that you can't communicate, but I was imagining something sort of quite like atmospherically played, where like there's not a lot of talking, there's not a lot of like you know, communicating about what you're going to do, which can be hard to do in a cooperative game, certainly one that has like, you know, like movement and like much strategic sort of range. Yeah. I don't know, I guess I feel like I could imagine, I don't know whether this would actually work within the game that we're imagining, but like quote unquote roles or like rules about movement which are sort of based on where another player's pieces are, or like you know, because we're a wolf pack and we have sort of like some kind of like social, you know, like hierarchy or like,
it's actually a common misconception, but I'm
no,
happy
I know
for it
there's
to stay
no
in the game.
wolves. But like, you know, but that to some extent like our behavior depends on our other like players. But I don't know how that would work, and would that end up being kind of circular and rubbish?
I
think that sounds good. I mean, I could imagine sort of one player having a card which says something like, your wolf must, you know, there must always be at least one wolf to the north of your wolf, or something along those lines.
Or things like that, or it may be if like if one player didn't move this turn, you also don't get to move this turn or something. That might cause like negative snowballs, but rules that are dependent on what other people do or where other people are, that you maybe you can't communicate them directly, but maybe when someone does something that's going to affect your ability to do something, you can do some kind of indication. That's like the most vague, the most vague sentence ever, but I know what I mean. I really like the idea that if there's like a river, you know, you have to like get two wolves into a like one above the other arrangement to get over it or something. So that it's about sort of creating particular configurations to overcome a set of challenges. So it's working together, it's limited communication, it's movement strategy. Another variation on this game would be for it to be like the prey player versus the pack player, in which case the prey player would have to have like one piece that just had amazing moves. But I don't know if I like that as much as a cooperative limited communication movement strategy.
Yes. I don't know, but I can still imagine, even in the like cooperative version, you know how like a deer or an antelope or whatever, like its built-in evolutionary strategy is to like move in an unpredictable way, and that's why deer are kind of bonkers. So
Yeah.
so maybe like insofar as the game has kind of like programmed, or
Yeah.
like you know, it has a way of making the prey animal move, it could be like that you don't know what it's going to do.
I think that's a really good idea. We do quite like to make a game with an automated opponent on Crow Jam, and I think you could use randomness really effectively to make the prey animal sort of move around the board and add more complexity to what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I was also thinking that it might be possible for the kind of the environment to change as you play, just so that it's not a kind of static environment that you're playing in. So sure, at one point there's river, but then maybe later, I don't know, there's some rocky mountainous terrain, or some woodland. And I suppose the idea would be kind of you're chasing the prey through various terrain, and that's why the terrain is changing.
So the terrain's like scrolling.
Yeah,
like...
exactly.
Oh,
Okay.
I love that. So like
that's so fun.
So to kind of visualize it again, I'm going to redraw the board while talking. So talking and drawing at the same time, using literally all of the processors that my brain has. Here's a grid. And then like each turn you would kind of get like a row of stuff would get swept off this side, and then a new row of stuff would be slotted in. So like this whole column would be filled in and this whole column would be wiped out, so that it was like a constantly shifting, everything would have to move along. Oh, it would be so fiddly. I love it.
Yeah, I suppose you'd want to make sure that there weren't so many pieces that it was
it would just be like, I suppose, 1 to 2 things. And you could do that. So I also sketched up like you could have a 4-sided die that turns up the like cardinal directions, and then maybe flip a coin that says 1 or 2 to say how many spaces the prey animal moves, so that it's, there's a fairly wide array of positions it could end up with. There's 8 possible positions it could end up in, but you can't predict them, only that you could know like where it won't end up or something. I feel like this actually feels like a real game. Like that does not always happen on Video Crow Jam. Like sometimes we invent a huge box of moss that you used to play geological scale golf.
I think that to add into the like prey animal movement, you would hope that it also has some automated behaviors that just kind of preserve its survival, right? Like if it gets close to a wolf,
it'll move away,
turns around and sort of like natural behaviors, so that the players can't just sort of wait for it to run into their open jaws.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair. Although it does sort of, I do like the idea of opening up the opportunity for ambush predator behavior. Like
yes,
you're not, so you could use the terrain to your advantage, right? Like if there's a tree between you and the prey, then it can't see you and it won't act in accordance with that. Like it won't move away from you because it doesn't know you're there. Like that seems fair enough.
Yes.
So yeah, I really, this idea is speaking to me in some massive way. I think it's just that it's like, I think it's because I think it's crunchy and light.
Perfect. The dream's been achieved.
I just feel like we've made a real biscuit here.
So one other thing I was thinking about when you were talking about, could we do a kind of 2-player version where someone plays as the prey? So I agree that I think I prefer purely cooperative games. So maybe just a completely different version would be where maybe you play as a herd of bison, deer, and as the herd, you've got to move away from, or sort of keep your members of the herd safe from, I don't know, a lone tiger or something that's stalking. So it's still working as a group, you're playing as a herd together, but now the roles are reversed and you're trying to avoid this predator that's moving around on the map. You've still got some movement restrictions as well.
Yeah, that's also very interesting.
So I completely love that as the idea that these are two games that come in the same box.
Yeah.
So instead of defining it as like wolves and elk or antelope and tiger, you just have these like completely generic prey tokens, like herbivore features like widely spaced eyes and then some kind of more pointy creature with forward facing eyes that, and they just represent like these kind of generic, these archetypes of predator and prey. And maybe like just thinking about the relationship to chess, I talked before about the idea of maybe like campaign play where you set up different scenarios, but there's kind of a thing in chess to like set up positions from historical games, right, and then play those out.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you could maybe like just have an array of starting positions with maybe particular objectives, so it doesn't even have to be, like the predators have to all surround the prey. Maybe it's they have to like corner it or things like that. So then you could have some versions that do use the scrolling terrain idea, which I just think is so cool for like a longer game, or somewhere the terrain setup is really, really fixed and you have to do it in like a controlled area.
Yeah, that sounds perfect, especially because maybe a scrolling terrain would feel a bit much, especially if you're playing for the first couple of times. But then once you got used to the game and the mechanics, you sort of introduce these additional elements.
I think it's something we really like to do in Crow Jam games, is to have something that has like a real replayability quality to it. That like that it's really different the third and fourth time you play it.
And we can do that because we never have to make the games we
never
invent.
have to make the game.
Although we did do some playtesting yesterday. That was
we
fun.
did. It was I feel like we're quite onto something with what we've been playtesting.
What have you been playing? Are you allowed to share?
Yeah, we shared the idea in full on a podcast. So,
yes, the listener will know. We collaborated on a prototype for Stack Shake, which is a dungeon delving puzzle game set in a subterranean library with a push your luck element. That includes a boggle box that you shake numbered dice in.
Oh, I mean, that sounds like loads of fun. That sounds really good.
It was a fun play test. So all right. So in terms of
the herbivore's so derpy and the carnivore's so angry.
That sounds like carnivore.
It's like they're a couple and oh my god, Deborah.
What? All right. So I mean, I am inclined to say that we're most of the way there with the game idea. So things that we might also talk about at this stage, we might talk about imagining how a turn might go. We might think about look and feel. We might also start thinking about what we would name something like this.
Timer-wise, we're like 18 minutes in.
I know.
So this is like an insane.
I know, this is easily the fastest we've ever done it on a video episode.
I'm going to say that as a compliment.
Multitask on the drawing and thinking. So in terms of turns, this is where I often get bogged down because there's some kind of rad idea on the table and I'm like, but how would that work, and would that work? But so if we imagine, we're playing like a wolf pack game where we will try to corner our prey. So like we win if we either surround it or we get it like trapped in a corner of the board or against a like impassable terrain element. And then let's say I have a movement rule that means I can't move like too many spaces closer to the prey. Like I have more of a a behavior that inclines me towards like spreading out and trying to like cover angles,
Mhm.
And then Georgia, maybe you have some sort of movement thing that means that you always have to try and keep a line of sight with the prey.
Okay.
I don't know what any of this would mean, but yeah, I suppose it's when it comes to movement, it's much more difficult to try and imagine a turn.
So I would just sort of thinking aloud. So the target prey animal would have its programming, right, which is like a move or pair of moves perhaps that it takes on its turn, where it first moves in a straight line a set number of spaces away from the nearest predator, and then it also does something unpredictable. Now, other than the movement rules about what we can and can't do, is there like a baseline set of rules, set of moves that predators can make? So can all of us move up to 3 spaces on our turn, but it just depends on various things? Or is it more interesting if, one of us is much faster and gets more movement on our turn, but maybe is more dependent, like doesn't always get to do that, can only do it if there's a lot of, like, if there's clear line of sight between them and the prey? What do we think?
Yeah, I think there's a danger of making the game too complicated or messy if every wolf has just kind of a different way to move as a baseline. So I really like the idea of, okay, as a standard, each wolf can move up to 3 spaces in one direction. And then there are additional kind of, I don't know, cards that they get to kind of restrict their movement in some way, or to, I mean, it could even be a card that gives them some sort of bonus thing. You can move an additional space if the prey is within your line of sight. But yeah, I like the idea that there's kind of standard movement, so that everyone at least has a rough idea what the other wolves might be doing, and then some additional limitations. I think it's easier then to kind of deduce what those limitations are or what those bonuses are if you know that there is a kind of, a base movement to begin with.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. It made me wonder whether, is it the case that, so there's 2 ways I can imagine this working, or maybe 3. I'll start with perhaps the simplest one, which is that you draw a card that has a restriction or a bonus on it, and that is your thing for the entirety of gameplay. So it could be something good, or it could be something that makes movement more difficult for you. The other players don't know if it's something good or something bad, and you just play accordingly. The slightly more complicated version of that was that everyone gets a restriction and a bonus. So you just draw 1 card each from 2 decks. One of them puts some kind of limitation on you, one of them puts some kind of benefit to you. And then the third version would be archetypes that incorporate a restriction and a bonus in some way thematically. So like, you're the scout, you get an extra square of movement when you have clear line of sight, but you lose a square of movement if another wolf is directly next to you.
I think that I would probably lean towards the first option you outlined. Ollie, what do you think?
Interesting. So have either of you played I forgot what the company is called, but they make a Sprawlopolis, Natropolis, Agropolis.
I have not played any of those games.
I
know of them.
Yeah, they're fantastic. I would definitely recommend. So they're card-based games where at the beginning of the game you flip over a bunch of cards which give you some objectives, and they'll say things like, oh, you get 1 point for each park on the edge of your city, but you lose 1 point for each park on the interior of your city. You gain 3 points for each road that goes between 2 lakes, but you lose a point for each road that doesn't. Something along those lines. So you could incorporate both the sort of restriction and bonus onto a single card, was what I was thinking of. And I love the idea that these cards are kind of thematic. So maybe 1 card just says scout on it, and gives you both that bonus and restriction at the same time.
Okay. Yeah,
I see that.
I think that was maybe the solution that I landed on thinking was most cool. It would obviously, like, if we were in the business of making this game, it would mean making like a good sized deck of those ideas, both for the predators and potentially for the prey, if we're doing the version where you can play the way. But actually I think that's, there's something quite good about that. And especially, thinking about this idea about a game where you use animal instincts, or that's really about being an animal. You could draw quite a lot of inspiration from real nature, thinking about how herd animals behave, like the idea that the herd will try and like surround the more vulnerable members, so you could have a one that has a benefit when they're adjacent to 2 or more other prey animals, and so on. So I think we're thinking of this as like a 2-player game, I think. No, we're not. No, we're thinking of it as
Georgia just loves 2-player games. She gravitates to a 2-player game.
I do naturally gravitate to a 2-player game, but that's not at all what I was actually thinking. What I was thinking is that scenarios would have a set number of pieces, but then the player controlled pieces, I guess, would have to be like divided up. So you could have, for example, a pack of 8 wolves and 2 or 4 players. If you had 3 players, I guess you'd have to have 6 or 9 wolves. But do you see what I mean? Like, would the limitation belong to the player or to the piece? Because it would be really hard to keep track of if it belonged to the piece.
Yeah.
Interesting. So I was thinking, oh, sorry, go on.
No, you go, Ollie.
Well, so I mean, I think either could work fine. So I'm not committed one way or the other. I was thinking if each of the wolf pieces, I can imagine sort of double-sided wooden tokens or cardboard tokens, and on one side each of the wolf pieces is a different color, and then it's really easy to track, oh, I'm playing the red wolf, you're playing the green wolf, and then on the other side it can be a sort of just generic gray color for when you're playing as the prey. So yeah, I think you could sort of keep track of, oh, I'm playing the red wolf, so the red wolf has these restrictions, and you're playing as the blue wolf, so the blue wolf has these other restrictions.
So yeah, my question about this is, I was imagining a scenario where one player could control up to 3 wolves. So I think the simplest version would be that all of them had the same restrictions, but the most interesting version would be like that you would have per wolf restrictions and per wolf rules.
Because there's definitely some restrictions that will be more valuable when that animal can act on its own, which I suppose is not ruled out if multiple animals have the same thing. But like if there's a benefit to you moving by yourself, then like all your wolves would always have to be spreading out. And
yeah, so one way that I could see to do this would be for all the animal tokens to have a unique color, but then the cards that tell you what their movement is, you would also just get a set of, I'm basically thinking of those like novelty paper clips that are a bit more detailed than a normal paper clip in the corresponding colors, and you can clip those to your cards that you can see. So your fellow player can't see what's on your cards, but you can see what rules associate with what wolf at a glance.
Hell yeah. I think that would make it really doable. So especially if you're not going to play more than 3 wolves at a time.
Yeah.
Like if you're just holding 3 cards and each one has a little clip, that feels like it might sometimes cause the phenomenon where you think you know what you're going to do, and then when it comes to moving that one, you're like, oh, I got things mixed up or whatever. But I think that's okay.
So there's like a very simple visualization of what I mean, basically, like that you've got two cards, each of them associate to a wolf of a specific color, and you have done that. You've created that relationship just using the colored tags. And then you could have exactly the same for the prey animals. There's a potential like accessibility color thing, but I think that's fairly solvable for in the abstract. But always worth thinking about when you're doing stuff with color, making it accessible to people with like vision differences.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. There's something that feels very neat about that to me, and something that I like about this game is how that it's got like components. You've got lots of tokens, but all the tokens would be the same like size and shape, and just, you know, double-sided printed. All the cards would be the same. We're not looking at sort of masses of different things.
Yeah,
I really like that.
Yeah, that's nice and neat. Something I was thinking about is it might get to a point in the game where you find that you can't respect the restriction on your card, or maybe you realize that you've violated a restriction on your card. And I don't like the idea that that just means you lose. So maybe there's a way of, I don't know, accruing some sort of penalty. Yeah, you violate a restriction, or you can't keep to a restriction, which is kind of sort of severe enough that you don't want to do it, but not so severe that it kind of ends the game or makes the game feel like, oh, there's no point kind of continuing. So that's kind of, something to think about maybe.
I think it's a really good question. It feels to me like here's a possible solution. So like the first time you find you can't do it, you simply don't move. You can't meet the requirements of your movement, so you can't move that wolf. The second time, if it comes back around to that wolf's turn, stick a pin in this because we need to talk about turn order in a moment. Then, and it still can't move, then there's some kind of, you can move it to a new position, but you take some kind of penalty for that. I'm not sure what it would be.
If I can raise this, like, I like the idea that there are like strict restrictions on movement that either just must apply, or if they're broken, there's a penalty. But I did think that we were talking about cards which only say like bonus if you achieve this, like, I guess like one space movement penalty if you don't achieve this. That sounded like what our restrictions, the form that they were coming in. Like,
that's what I've been writing on the example cards, and that would definitely be a simple way to do it, and it would mean that the movement rules were never unobservable.
But maybe we just want to make it so that it's slightly more strict, like maybe you can only ever move one space if you're not doing your thing or something.
Yeah, or like, I think that is quite good, like to make it, you know, not just that your movement is slightly reduced, but it's reduced to 1, or
Oh, I see. So sorry, just so the idea would be something like, okay, you can move up to 3 spaces if this condition is met, otherwise 1 in sort of any direction. Was that the idea there?
Yes, although I don't know if that's too mean.
I think it's a good example of something that would be sort of like interesting to balance mechanically and boring to balance podcast wise.
Frequently come across those.
We always have to balance our interest in the sort of mathematics of balancing games with our interest in making a listenable podcast. But I do think there are I see some potential solutions, some of which would be to create movement rules that are basically not unbreakable, but, you know, that wouldn't break the game. And then other ways would be to have some potential movement rules that were much stricter than that, but then also introduce some kind of penalty for getting stuck. Because the other thing that could happen, I think, would be the prey animal getting stuck. That feels like a more likely outcome. If it always wants to move away from the closest predator and you've got it cornered, well, then you've basically won, I suppose.
Yeah, maybe that's not
It's kind of a checkmate.
a
You could also have one thing that might be fun for replayability reasons would be to have different move sets for the automated opponent, whether that's the predator or the prey. Like you could have one that can jump over rocks but can't jump over trees and things like that.
Yeah, really.
I think we could. I think there would be the potential to do quite a lot of interesting play testing and experimentation with things like the ability to pass, to jump over particular terrain objects and things like that. Like that might present a really big advantage. So maybe it would also come with a sort of correspondingly annoying disadvantage or things like that. So I wanted to talk briefly about turn order because I think it seems that we are describing a game with 2 or more cooperative players where each controls probably a minimum of 2 pieces. So does play proceed like player 1 moves piece 1, player 2 moves piece 1, player 1 moves piece 2? Do you see what I mean? Does play like, do you get to move all your pieces on your turn or just one in a set order?
I think it's
I will say I think it's more interesting to move just one.
Yes.
And I think you could track that by using the tagged cards. So you would just, the card that you just move, like if you have cards in positions 1, 2, and 3, you make the move with the card in position 1, then move that card to position 3.
Okay, yes.
The only thing is that might mean like there would be a moment where it was really tactical to move one of your pieces and you're not allowed to, in which case maybe you just choose which of your pieces you move every single turn.
Yeah, I wonder. I can also see it working if you just move all of your pieces on your turn. Like, I don't think that's necessarily like a major disadvantage to the game.
You can always choose to pass with a piece if you want to.
Yeah.
And potentially make some kind of interesting strategic moments where thinking about movement benefits, say you've got one that benefits from moving when there's nothing around it and one that benefits from moving when it's next to something. The order in which you activate those 2 pieces might enable you to get more movement out of both of them, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
So that could make for some nice, like crunchy thinking for people who like to do that kind of thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. That suggests that maybe then it's nice if you can move all your pieces on your turn, right? So you move one of your pieces so that it's next to the other one, and then you move the other one sort of immediately. Was that the
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. So getting to move all your pieces on your turn, we think, is more strategically interesting, and you can always choose not to.
Yes.
Like you always have the option to not take an action.
But it does mean that you can also choose like which order your pieces are going to go in.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I think I like that.
So sorry.
Sorry, you carry on, Ollie.
Something I was wondering about here. So we started off by imagining that the players didn't know what each other's movement restrictions or bonuses were.
Yes, I was just about to bring the limited communication back up.
Yeah, do you still think that's necessary? Or maybe that would be just sort of a horrible kind of extra element that makes it sort of too difficult. Maybe now it would be fine to know what the other players kind of want from you, and then you can actively sort of help them. But maybe the limited communication is, still valuable. I'm genuinely unsure.
Something that keeps coming out to me about this game is that it is a game where you could keep it very replayable by introducing different elements and different scenarios that ramp up or decrease the difficulty. So perhaps the simplest answer to this question is it's not a limited communication game the first time you play it, but by the 6th or 7th time you play it, it is. Like,
I have to say that a thing I've been really enjoying about imagining the play is I've been imagining it where people aren't speaking too much. Maybe that speaks to something about how I like to enjoy games, but but I think it's more just kind of like in the sort of thematic atmospheric style of the thing we're imagining. I like the idea of, you know, we're playing as wolves. This is like an instinct game. Everything we do, we just have to kind of do based on like what we see and how the pieces are moving, and we're not necessarily like, you know, like talking through every single thing.
Yeah, I think I agree with you there, Miriam. I think that is something that makes this feel really thematic and special. I mean, the truth is about limited communication games is that participating in the limited communication is always optional. Like sometimes if you don't participate in it, then you're not making the game very fun. Like if you're playing charades and you talk, then you're not like playing it very well. But you always can't, you know, people always do like, oh no, or like you're close. So I don't think it needs to be like a written rule that limited communication is optional. I think we might just say that like the game as we imagined it is one that's played in silence or close to silence.
Howling only.
Howling only.
We're getting much closer to the like regular average length of time it takes us to sort of like close out more of a complete idea. We've got 20 minutes left on the clock, which is usually
about the time we move on to look and feel.
Yeah, like in an audio episode, we would start maybe thinking about what does it look like? What's the illustration style? What's the kind of brand? This feels almost I'm imagining in my head kind of like quite simple, sort of like Scandinavian, you know,
Yes.
like wooden components, like sort of minimalist design to some extent, is what I've been imagining.
That's exactly what I've been imagining as well, which probably comes across in what I've been drawing. I was initially imagining kind of like, you know, custom meeples like you might get in Root or something like that, where like they have a shape. But then Ollie's idea about things being double-sided so that you can use them differently for different scenarios made sense to me. So, you know, kind of like round, thick wooden coin tokeny pieces, you know, like big drafts pieces with double-sided 2-color illustrations. I think the cards, I like the idea of them having like archetype names and then your rules and maybe like a very simple illustration.
But it feels like they've got like quite a lot of weight
yeah,
to me as well.
Yeah.
Like a high GSM or whatever the hell.
I think the even though they're plasticky, I think the pieces from Hive have kind of informed how I've thought about this quite a lot. You know, things having a thickness to them, making a sound when you put them down or move them. You know, there's something quite tactile. I do think at the very least, if we wanted to, the terrain pieces, you know, those are the same no matter what. So those could be kind of like custom shaped pieces.
Oh, yeah,
I think that would be quite nice. We know that we want it to have quite a good selection of colors so that you can indicate the different things. I also had that idea about the kind of like special clips. I'm going to try and draw the kind of clip that I mean. So they have this kind of, so it's like punched out of metal. And it's got a little piece that kind of, you could use it as like a little bookmark or something like that, so that it's got a flap. I think that having something like that would be really cute. Yeah, this was one of the ones, this doesn't always happen for me at all, but I feel like really early on I had a sense of the look and feel. I think the board it's played on to me almost feels like, you know, just a square with lines on it. Like maybe it's made of laser engraved wood or something. Every time I drew it, I drew a 5x5, and I think that might be too few. spaces.
I would agree. It felt like it was a bigger grid, quite a lot bigger to me.
Yeah, maybe 8x8 like a chessboard, or maybe even more.
That's something that would probably take like play testing and balancing, but
yeah, absolutely.
The nature of like a wide-ranging hunt.
Sorry, I really like the idea of the grid itself being fairly plain, and then the kind of terrain tokens what sort of brings it to life. I like that idea a lot.
Yeah, you could make a forest or a savanna, or like a completely empty space for like a really abstract version of the game. We also, or I was mainly me that talked about this, but sort of talked about there being like particular play setups and stuff. So I feel like it would come with a little booklet, which I guess would maybe be like a combination rules booklet and scenarios. Like, so it would just have a diagram for how to set up, and then like what the winning objective is for the players.
Yeah.
Actually, yeah, speaking of diagrams, I don't know how feasible this would be, but I like the idea that the cards which show you your kind of movement restrictions or bonuses, that information is largely got across diagrammatically. That would be kind of ideal.
So that was something that I tried to do on this slide. Like it's when I was illustrating it. So like, using the iconography of the game quite a lot. Something we haven't come back to was this idea that the player tokens might be able to overcome a terrain, which I guess would mean like remove a piece of terrain from play if they got into particular arrangements. I don't know if we lost that, or if it just sort of fell off, but I do still quite like the idea that might be possible, that if a tree is causing you problems, you could do something about it, but maybe that sort of goes thematically a bit less realistic.
It does feel like, in terms of like when that would be necessary, really like a river, or perhaps like a cliff or a steep slope, but like the main ones that would be a big time obstacle, whereas like a tree does feel like something that a wolf could use, run around.
Maybe it's not an idea we need to hold on to, but I did think it was a really interesting
well, I liked the idea of like,
there
being a sort of criterion for crossing a river, but maybe we don't need to discuss it too heavily on the episode.
Do we have any thoughts on what it might be called?
I can imagine, like a really simple name like Pack.
Pack was at the front of my mind. Hunt. Or you could call it like Pack/herd. Because you're either acting as a pack or a herd.
You could call it Instinct.
I mean, it's always a temptation to name the game whatever the prompt was. I don't think we've ever done it, so I think we could be allowed to do it. Miriam also mentioned Hunt, which I think is quite good. Maybe this is too complicated of a name for a simple game, but like Animal Instinct.
I was also like animal behavior.
The game is so simple that I do think a one word title is going to be what I like the most. Are there other words for groups of animals that are a bit more all purpose? It's interesting to me, like, there's obviously a semantic thing that's happening with the difference between a pack and a herd and what they do. Like, one of those is for prey animals and one of them is for predators. So I was wondering if there's like another all-purpose word.
I'm not thinking of one, just like group. Collective.
Your classic collective nouns are all too specific.
Nothing's jumping to mind.
Is there like predate? I don't know if I like that. Okay, my favorites of these are Pack, Hunt, and Instinct. I don't know if anyone's got opinions.
Maybe we should go with Instinct. I like a name that kind of like gives you a little bit of like flavor of what's the play experience is like, I guess.
Yeah.
Which is sort of that, like it tells you that like you're going to be moving more based on a thing that I quite like, and you don't see it very often, is like a spatial strategy game, but where the thinking isn't heavily, I guess, kind of verbal or like, so like, for example, in Lacuna, where it's a spatial strategy game, but it's almost entirely based on just like looking at the spread of where things are.
Yeah, and so Lacuna's a really good example for that because it's so vibes based. Like, you'd think there would be constant disagreements about like, well, actually those two are closer together, but you just look at it and everyone can tell.
So yeah, I think I'm in favor of Instinct, and I think this came out like a pretty cool game.
Yeah, this was a really, really enjoyable episode, really interesting, and I feel like we've come up with something that does have quite a lot of legs. Interestingly, the big crow, quite a lot of legs, loads of animals, bloody loads of legs. Well, the big crow game that it reminds me of the most is another game with a load of animals and loads of legs, and that's Vivarium, which was a game about like dropping lizards into a space. But one of the big things that came out of that was that you could play it a bunch of different ways. You kind of just had the pieces and the scenarios, but there were all types of different ways to use those pieces to create a fun experience. And that's sort of how this feels to me.
Game we've worked on that heavily reminds me of is Tracks, or I was just calling it Green Game for a while. Like, it's grid based, there's animals, they move in different ways.
It also reminded me of Tracks, which we've never talked about in the podcast, but was Miriam's first foray into game design, I believe.
Oh, cool.
Yes.
Oh, great minds.
Anyway, thank you so much for joining us, Ollie.
No, thank you so much. It was loads of fun. I really enjoyed it. And yeah, I was really excited about this design as well. This sounds
I don't know if you have anything that you want the listener to check out, either, that's you, or that is just stuff that you think is cool, that you want to plug at the end of the episode.
Oh, I mean, nothing for me personally. There are definitely lots of games which I think are very cool, which I would encourage listeners to check out. Yeah, are they called button shy games? I would have to double check, but certainly Sprawlopolis, Netropolis, they're really fantastic small card games that I would 100% recommend. And yeah, they're very straightforward, but they have a kind of similar-ish vibe to the game we've been describing today. So yeah, I guess Sprawlopolis and Netropolis would be the two that I recommend people go and look at.
Button Shy sounds correct. I bought one of them for my boss for his birthday, and I think it was that. And yeah, thank you, listener, for joining. We love you, listener.
We love you, listener.
Come back next time for more Crow Jam.
Cool.